Hey there, welcome back to Geeky Greenhouse. In today's video, I'll show you how I made this wooden gardening table. So we grow a lot of peppers and other plants that require early seed starting indoors. And with a new space for growing indoors, I wanted to make the perfect table for seed starting. Now, I'm not a woodworker. I definitely made some mistakes and it's imperfect, but that's okay. This table is going to get a lot of use and we're going to put it through its paces. And the main goal was not making a beautiful piece of furniture, but rather a utilitarian sort of piece. Now the table costs about $100 with materials, but lumber is especially high right now. And it's going to depend on the tools that you have. I used a drop saw and a hand saw along with a drill. I also added some stain and some polyurethane to the top. I'll probably add some protective coating to the rest of the table at some point. But for now, the top is definitely going to get the most use and it's most likely to get wet. So the design is really simple. It's sort of this farm style table. I found a design online from a professional woodworker that was actually for a coffee table and I just modified it a little bit to be taller. So it's about 36 inches tall and 59 inches long and just about 2 feet wide. So that's the perfect space for us. It fits these seed trays. We can fit a bunch of these as the plants grow and we need to spread them out. And then down below we have a shelf for storage. We can put bins down there. We can put all of our seed starting supplies, trays, pots, lights, nutrients, soil, anything that we need hopefully will fit down there. And I think this table would be really easy to modify if you wanted to make something really long or wide, or maybe you wanted a sitting table. It'd be really easy to do and just modify the length of the legs or the length of the top boards. But for us, we wanted a standing table so we can do our work while we're standing. It's going to be great to be able to plant our seeds up at a standing height and tend to our plants as they're growing in the early spring. All right, so step one was getting some lumber from the lumber store. What I needed were 6 2x6s and 4 2x4s, and these are approximately 8 feet in length. So for the 2x6s, we needed 12 pieces cut to 18.5 inches, 4 pieces cut to 59 inches. I actually cut these to about 60 inches or so and then cut off the remaining once it was in place on the top. For the 2x4s, 4 pieces to 55 inches and 4 pieces to 35 inches. So I started by marking the length and drawing lines on the wood to make the cuts, making sure everything was square. It's worth mentioning that this is framing wood. It's really inexpensive fir. Definitely not suited for outdoor use, but it's perfectly fine for indoor. Then I used the drop saw to make the cuts along the lines. And a happy me finally done cutting. And there the pieces are, freshly cut and ready to be sanded. Next step is to get everything smoothed out and sanded. As you can see all of these frayed edges. I chose to do this by hand, but if I were to make one change, I definitely would have got an orbital sander. It would have saved a lot of time and energy, so I think if I make anything else out of wood in the future, I will definitely be getting one. Just making sure that any imperfections or knots were sanded. So with all the structural pieces sanded, I was ready to start assembling the table. And for that, I just used 2.5-inch screws. These are outdoor screws, but you could use any flat wood screw. And the correctly sized drill bit. I should have used a countersink in retrospect, but I didn't have one. So the first step was to make the top of the table. This is basically comprised of 2 2x4s at 55 inches, and then 3 boards, 2 of them on either end and 1 in the middle. This will be the top of the table supporting the top boards. I started by drilling some holes and putting some screws in. And again, the final product looked like this. With the top done, the next step was to add the legs. This part was actually pretty tricky. I'm not sure what I should have done here. To drill, I turned the top upside down and put the legs upright. You can see how I drilled the legs into the top piece. Next up were the running boards for the bottom shelf. Again, just some drilling and screws. And here's how that looked when it was done. And now I had the basic framework for a table in place. Next up was adding the 18.5-inch boards for the bottom shelf. I started with the 2 pieces on either end and screwed those into place. Then I roughly positioned the other 7 pieces and then measured to make sure that the spaces between each of them was equal. Minor setback with my drill bit, and then back to screwing pieces into place. This is really satisfying in fast motion, but it actually took a really long time. And this is what the table looked like at this stage. Almost a table, but definitely needs something up top. We'll get to that later. At this point, it was definitely taking a lot longer than I expected it to, but at least I was learning and having fun. Here's where I definitely think I made a mistake. I sanded the table after I had already assembled it. I think I probably should have sanded the pieces in their entirety before I put the table together, but this is how I did it. Quick cleanup with the shop vac. This was really satisfying, believe it or not, just picking up those tiny particles of sawdust. Next was a quick rub down with a lint-free cloth, just to pick up any remaining particles. And then I was ready to start staining. I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to inhale any dangerous fumes, so I opened up our bulkhead and had a fan going, because there really wasn't any good way to get this thing out of the basement. Hopefully we'll never have to get it out of the basement, but who knows. So I used this wood staining cloth. It's basically just a big sponge for applying stain. And the finish I used was golden oak. It's an oil-based finish. So applying this was really simple. You just kind of wipe it on in the direction of the wood grain. You can let it sit as long as you want on the wood, but I basically just wiped it on and then wiped it off with a cloth, just to get a really mild stain on the wood. I didn't want it to be too dark. So just filling in all the spots, wiping it off, and letting it dry for about 2 or 3 hours. In the meantime, I started preparing the 2x6s for the top of the table. Again, starting off by sanding everything. This was a pretty grueling process by hand. Again, I really think I would have benefited from using an electric sander. And wiping down the boards with a lint-free cloth. I think I was pretty proud of myself at this point because this was pretty tough. And then back to staining and wiping off the stain. And then here are the boards when they were finished. I should mention at this point that one side of the boards were not cut. I ended up screwing the boards into place and then cutting off on either side to cut them to length. Now after those dried, it was time to apply some polyurethane. So I moved out into the garage for this because I didn't want to risk the fumes. I just used a satin oil-based polyurethane. And per online instructions, I slowly added the polyurethane, but I think the brush I used was just a bit too small. Polyurethane takes a lot longer to dry, so after 3 coats and 3 full days of this process, the boards were finally ready to go onto the table. So here's where I think I made another mistake. I think I should have pre-drilled these boards before I applied the polyurethane. I'm really not sure how that process should be done, but by drilling into a polyurethaned board, I think I damaged the polyurethane finish. I ended up touching it up later, but definitely something I learned from. And here's where I really think a countersink would have made a big difference. Some of the screws damaged the polyurethane finish, requiring me to sand further and refinish those portions. Here's some really shaky footage of me hand sawing off the end of either side of the table. I was basically just cutting the boards to length on either side and evening everything up. Some quick sanding on either side. At this point, I switched to a tack cloth, which worked a lot better for picking up those dust particles. Then a quick staining on the edges and a coat of polyurethane. And we're basically done with the table at this point. All that was left was to spray paint these corner braces and screw them onto the corners of the table. Just a little aesthetic touch. And so that's our new table. What do you think? It's a lot of work, but the end result is just so satisfying. I hope this might inspire some of you to make your own gardening furniture for indoors. This has been a really fun project and I can't wait for more. If you haven't seen Pepper Geek, go follow us over there. That's our main channel where we go deep into growing peppers and experimenting and making hot sauces and fun stuff like that. So thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.